All right. Well, sorry that we couldn't join you in person today. We were down there presenting to your superintendents earlier this week, and just with everything going on with the session, it's hard to make 2 trips in a week out of Austin. Let me get my
I think Josh for
okay. Is that better? I think I'm back.
yeah.
Sorry about that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started, but I do want to just point out that the 1 week that Romalda comments on the beautiful faces she sees in person is the 1 week that we're not there. So Romalda, I did notice that. I just want to point that out, that, we have pretty thick skin. We won't get offended, but that didn't sneak by us. But we have a lot of stuff going on up at the Capitol, and we're going to spend most of the time talking about the property value study. I know we did our presentation on that last week, and so hopefully y'all were able to tune into that and got a little bit better sense of what the property value study is, how it works. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts on your funding. So let's go ahead and get started here. First bit of news is with the bond guarantee program. You guys have heard me ramble on about this quite a bit. And you guys have seen this slide before, so you should be aware of what the bond guarantee program is, or what the issue is. It's that federal limit, that third bullet point there is too low. We're bumping up against that. We did get some news. We've been talking to folks at SBOE and other advocacy organizations, and one sort of thing, this is largely a federal issue, but one thing that the state could, that was sort of an option for the state, was for the SBOE to reduce their reservation amount. So of all that capacity that they have, state board rules previously were to keep 5% of it in reserve. And we kind of pointed that out, saying, hey, there's really no need for that. That's not something that the bond rating agencies I don't think are going to be particularly concerned with. And so in the February meeting, the SBOE lowered that reservation from 5% to 0.25%. The bond rating agencies didn't really blink at all. And so they were fine with that reduction in reservation. And so that increased the capacity by, we're kind of waiting on final numbers from PSF, but the range from them was 7 to 9 billion of new capacity. And so that's good news. However, there's been a lot of bonds passed across the state over the past 2 plus cycles. And so, Austin has a $2.5 billion bond. Dallas has a $1 billion plus bond. So just with those 2 districts right there, that could, very well use up all that, or use a big chunk of that capacity. And so, that this is a short-term solution. Again, just to remind y'all, when capacity is reached on the bond guarantee program, whenever they have to ration capacity, they start with the districts that are property poorest, by property wealth per student, and work their way up, right? And so that rationing activity occurred in December when we hit the limit, or January when we hit the limit. And so this is going to buy us a little bit of time, but it's very, very likely that we'll hit that capacity limit again in the coming months. So this is somewhat good news, but we still need a federal solution to this, really. We need either the IRS to act, or we need Congress just to tell the IRS that they don't need to worry about this anymore. Just wanted to deliver a little bit of good news, because the rest of the presentation is not going to be a whole lot of good news. So I wanted to start off on a good note. Amy, why don't you walk us through some of the new faces on the House and Senate Ed committees?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. We are sad that we weren't able to join you in person this Friday. Senate Education Committee, these are the members of that committee on the Senate side. In some of these boxes, there's a green square around these faces. These are kind of the new and newish members to Senate Ed. We put Senator Creighton in the newish category because although he was interim chair of Senate Education, he wasn't the actual chair last session. New is also Senator Donna Campbell. She'll be serving as vice chair this session. And then we've got a few faces from the House, Senator Phil King, Senator Mays Middleton, Tan Parker, and I believe Drew Springer as well. And then some of the other ones are familiar faces we've seen on Senate Education for a while now. Senator Paul Betancourt, I believe Brian Birdwell, Senator Paxton, and then Senator West have been on the Senate Ed committee for a while. Moving over to the House.
And just real quick, of course, y'all, a senator from the Valley area, Senator Lamantia is also newly named to the Senate Ed committee, and so you know we're excited about what she can bring to that committee.
Thanks, Josh. And moving over to the House side, these just got released not too long ago. We have a lot of new faces on the House side. The biggest one is probably Chairman Brad Buckley will be serving as the chair. He's been a member of House Pub Ed for a few years now, and he's got a relationship with public education. I believe his wife is a school board member at Killeen, or he was a former school board member at Killeen. Also new is Vice Chair Alma Allen. She's been on the House Pub Ed committee for a while, but this is her first time serving as vice chair. And then moving on to the top row, brand new to the legislature and also new to House Pub Ed is Representative Charles Cunningham. When Chairman Dan Huberty left and came to Moat Casey, that spot became open for him. So I hear he's a great person and is also a former school board member. So you like that. Also some new faces, Representative Cody Harris, Brian Harrison. We've got Representative Cole Hefner down there and then kind of going in a circle, Representative Matt Schaefer, Oster Longoria, and Rep. Gina Hinojosa. Representative Hinojosa is also a former school board member in Austin. So we're pretty optimistic that when the voucher conversation starts to or continues to happen this session, that they will, I think the saying is that the vouchers go to die in House Pub Ed on the House side. So we're pretty optimistic, and just from a general count on the next slide, most of these, probably around 9 of these folks have not supported vouchers in the past. Josh, you have anything you want to add?
No, I would just add, we've met with Chairman Buckley, and we've done some sort of school finance 101 sessions with him and his staff, and really sharp. They strong supporters of Pub Ed, and he gets it. He's been on the committee before. Of course, as Amy mentioned, this is his first time as chair. I do think he's going to be a pretty solid advocate for public ed and getting us new investments in the school finance system. And I think that is about it. Also, we met with Representative Ken King. We think King is going to be carrying the school finance bill this session. And so, he's from Canadian, right, which is sort of a rural West Texas region. So he's very focused on sort of small district issues. And so that's, it's good that he at least has awareness of those, but we've been working with him on just sort of those more global, school finance issues that affect all school districts as well. But, again, Representative King has been around on the committee for a while. And so he knows school finance well, and I think he'll be a good partner for us this session as well.
And one last thing I do want to add about House Pub Ed in general. They are having their first hearing on Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. at the Capitol. So we will be monitoring that meeting, and we'll give you guys write up a summary and send that out as soon as we can this next week, early next week.
Yeah, and there are no bills that will be heard at that meeting. It's just going to be invited testimony from TEA and
the School Safety Center.
School Safety Center, yes, thank you. And so even though some of those, voucher issues and other property tax relief were named as emergency items by the governor, which could, allow them to be heard earlier. At least for this first meeting, there's no bills on that. So just wanted to make you all aware of that. And then also, just with regards to the emergency items, other governors have declared those emergency items much earlier than Abbott has this time. And they do that because it gives those issues more time, kind of gives them a head start in the legislative process. I think all non-emergency items can start being heard, I want to say, in mid-March. And so the fact that Abbott waited so long to declare those emergency items, it doesn't really give them much of an advantage in the Capitol. And I don't advocate putting on your tinfoil hat too often, but I would think that that's not a mistake. And so we're trying to read the tea leaves there a little bit, but there's we did sort of note that as being a little peculiar, and we're hopeful to see that, or hoping that means some of that talk around vouchers and that kind of stuff was more campaign talking points, and not going to be a huge focus from the governor's office during the session. But we'll see how that plays out. But that did give us a little bit of hope, as did the makeup of this committee, as Amy mentioned, and as you can see here. This is not their opinions on vouchers that are listed here are not written in stone, right? So this, the final, once the dust settles, the final votes could be different than what we have on the screen here. This just shows have they voted for or supported vouchers in the past. And so, the past is not always a perfect predictor of the future, but we feel pretty confident that a voucher bill is not going to make it out of Pub Ed, given the makeup of this committee. And
just to touch on some of the Governor Abbott's priorities, in case you guys didn't get to tune into the state of the state. He's been talking in recent months. I think he's been campaigning on this, and he mentioned it in his inaugural address. That sounds like the governor is really prioritizing those property tax cuts that we've been hearing about. He is really supportive of parental rights and school choice, as Josh just mentioned. And then he highlighted school safety as another emergency item for this session.
All right, we're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the property value study. Just statewide, this chart shows that we've seen really unprecedented levels of property value growth, almost 20% year over year, as reported on the property value study. And it's been pretty consistent across the state. Pretty much everywhere in the state is seeing double-digit growth. Region 1 is kind of right there on par with the rest of the state, a little bit higher at 21%. And you would have thought that would have kept it out of trouble on the property value study. You don't see really low levels of growth in Region 1 or anything that's sort of out of whack there on Region 1. But there was a pretty dramatic increase on districts that got state values assigned this year. And so you can see that reflected here. In the past 2 cycles on the prelim findings, we've had around 100 areas of the state that got state values assigned. This year has ticked up to more than 150. And just to be clear, as you can kind of see in that note there, districts that that span multiple counties would count multiple times in that column there. So just be aware of that I think there's only 149, 148 somewhere around there actual districts that got state values assigned, but some of them got invalid findings in multiple counties. So I just wanted to point out that you may see different numbers depending on how those folks are doing that analysis. Of course, you guys are well aware that Region 1 has a very high level of districts that got state values assigned. Pretty almost leading the state in that category, unfortunately, with just over 44% of districts in the region with state values assigned. You can see it's only Region 5 exceeds that at 51%. But when you look at it in terms of the property tax base that's impacted, Region 1 leads the state, unfortunately. And so what I mean by that is if you look at the difference between local values that you submitted, that Cameron and Hidalgo and the other counties in Region 1 submitted to the controller's office, and you compare that with the state values that the controller came up with, across the region, the controller values are almost 25% higher than the local values, right? And so, that's really where the rubber meets the road on the PDS, is how much of a discrepancy is there between those values, because that is what's going to drive the impact on your state aid. And before we get into the state aid impact, I want to just add a little bit more context. We talked about this a little bit during our webinar the other week. After that webinar, I realized, man, it would have been nice if I had this slide. So we prepared that and wanted to give you a little bit of a visual on sort of how the grace period eligibility works and how the you get your values certified or not. And so, your CAD does its assessment, its appraisal, figures out the values, and then sends that over to the state. The state uses its own data set called TransUnion, if you want to get into the weeds on that. But it has some sales transaction data and other items there. And your CAD doesn't really use that data, right? They don't necessarily have access to TransUnion. They may or may not, it kind of varies by CAD. But at any rate, the controller uses certain data that the CAD may not be using. And the controller also does its own sampling. Our executive director, Dr. Gilcrease, just I think last year got a survey in the mail from the controller's office. I was asking him all about the property that he purchased, and asking him, what the sales data was and all that kind of stuff. And so the controller's office does send out surveys and collects that data. And your CAD may not have access to that information, right? And also the timeline is different, and we touched on this a little bit in the webinar as well. The controller's office will take data, well, let me back up. All property in Texas is appraised and valued as of January 1 of each year. And so the CAD will appraise values with that in mind, right, as of January 1. And so they're doing their appraisal work in February and March, and they're kind of probably wrapping that up now for 2023. The controller's office will look at data from the summer following that, right? So let's go to 22, since that's what we're talking about now. Your CAD is going to look at data in February 22, March 22. They're going to do their taxpayer protests, all that stuff in the end of the spring, and wrapping that up in the summer to get you your certified values. The controller's office may look at sales data that transactions that occurred in the summer, right? And the controller's office does do some time adjustment and sort of looks at trends, and if there is a transaction in the summer, bring that back to what they think that property would be worth in as of January 1. But it's an estimate, right? It's a statistical model that they developed to sort of estimate what that property would be worth in as of January 1. And so that can introduce some discrepancies. And there's a whole host of other reasons why the data that's used by the CAD is different than the data that's used by the controller's office. And in years where there's a lot of growth and a lot of volatility in the property values, those different inputs are going to yield, right, different outputs. And so that's kind of the situation that we're in now. But the estimate of the values that the controller prepares on this slide is referred to as the state value. And so your local values are allowed to be within a certain confidence interval of that state value. For most districts, that's 5%, plus or minus 5% of the state value. You get your local value certified. If you're more than that high end of the confidence interval, you also get your local value certified. The controller's office will kind of let you know, hey, you look high, but they won't assign the lower state value, right? They're going to let you use your higher local value. As I note there with these asterisks here, that margin of error may be more than 5%, depending on calculations that are done by the controller's office. But again, for most districts, that range is plus or minus 5%. Again, we touched on this a little bit during our webinar. I'll go to the PBS real quick and just show you where you can find that. Let's see if I'm sharing my screen. Yes, okay, now I can see that. All right, so let's look at Cameron. And so the place to find that is looking at the confidence interval detail. And so you can see for Brownsville, there is the state value. And then there's a confidence interval on both sides of that. It looks like for Brownsville's case, always fun to do math with everybody watching. Let's see if I can do this correctly. It looks like a Brownsville case that is 5%. But let's just check the controller's office here. Yeah, so you can see this lower value is 5% or 95% of the state test value. But again, for other districts, particularly for smaller districts, that confidence interval range may be bigger because the sample from the controller's office is smaller. And with a smaller sample, the controller's office is less certain of that. They're less confident in this data point, right? So because they're less confident, they kind of broaden out that confidence interval, right? They could say it could be a broader range of values. We're just not sure because of that smaller sample. But for a bigger district like Brownsville, they have a larger sample. And so that usually that confidence interval is a little bit tighter for bigger districts. But it can't be less than 5%, right? It's going to be plus or minus 5% or greater than the state value. And so again, if you are within the minus 5% as the state value or higher, you will get your local value certified. Or I'm sorry, if you're above that lower confidence interval, then you'll get your local value certified. Again, it may not be exactly 5% for you. If you are within, so once you establish this floor, whatever that is, if it's plus or minus 5%, 6%, 7%, whatever, once you establish what this value is, then there's another threshold that's calculated that's 90% of this lower confidence interval boundary. So if you're within this 90% of the lower confidence interval or the lower confidence interval, then you do get local value certified if you're eligible for the grace period. If you're not eligible for grace, then this zone would result in getting state values assigned, right? And so again, just to point out, 90% of 95 is 85.5. If this confidence interval range is plus or minus 7%, let's say for you, this would shift down right to 93. This would shift down to 90% of that. So just understand that these are kind of, what I'm talking about is what's going to apply to most of y'all. But again, your mileage may vary, and you can see what that is for you by going again to that confidence interval detail page on the 22 prelim results. This is your state value, right? That total test value under the state value column, right? So this data point here represents this number, right? At 100%. The lower limit represents this number. The upper limit is obviously this higher confidence interval number. And then this 90% is not listed on here, but it would be 90% of this lower limit. Whatever that is, that would trigger, that would be where this line is drawn. So you can see for Brownsville and many of y'all in Region 1, if we calculate this out, so let's see, 952365838 times 0.9, right? For Brownsville, this line is drawn at 8.5, let's call it 8.6 billion, right? They had a local test value of 7.4. Okay, so for Brownsville and many of y'all in Region 1, you guys were below this 90% confidence interval threshold, and automatically got state values assigned, right? Grace period was not an option for y'all under the way that the law currently is. And so just wanted to kind of make y'all aware of sort of how this process works, and how if you are doing a protest, right, you don't necessarily have to get all the way to 100%, right? You just need to get, I think most of y'all in Region 1 are eligible for grace this year. So you don't necessarily need to get to 100. You can, if you can just get yourself, back into this grace period range, then you could get your local value certified. And just be clear, you're not raising your local values. What you're actually doing is lowering your state values to the point where that 7.4 billion for Brownsville, for example, would fall here, right? And so that's the task of a protest. When you're protesting state value, that's what you're doing, is you're bringing this 100% figure down, right? So that way your local values are included either in this grace period, if that's an option for you, or back in this local value certified range. So that way, if grace period isn't an option. So I know that was a lot. Let's see, Amy, would you mind checking the chat? It's not letting me click on that.
There are no questions in the chat.
Oh, okay, sorry, I see an alert there. Okay. Oh, it's floor. Okay. All right, I'm going to skip ahead to the grace period slides. I want to show y'all this. So when we talked about what values you need to potentially qualify for grace period. There's also rules about just overall grace period eligibility for your CAD. And the main rule here for grace period is, obviously you can't be below that threshold we talked about. But if you're within that grace period threshold, you have to have received valid findings on the PBS in the past 2 cycles. Okay. And so you can kind of see how this plays out for y'all. I kind of put this example together. If you get state values assigned to 22, we hope that your protests are successful, but let's say this just stays on the books. You will get another PBS assigned to you in 23. I guess I should back up here. There's cycles of PBS for CADs. They don't do the property value study for every CAD in every year. They do a PBS every other year. And so you can see sort of the general cycle described up here, right? So 22 is a PBS year for y'all, property value study year. That would mean 23 is a MAP year. MAP stands for Methods and Assistance Program. That's really just a long questionnaire that CADs have to answer. It's not an assessment of the property values in the district. And so, it's a little bit easier for districts to, for CADs to pass. We do see some CADs that get in trouble with map review. But generally speaking, it's not as rigorous as the PBS. So, again, generally the cycle is PBS 1 year, MAP the next year, PBS the following year, MAP the next year. If you fail the PBS or you get invalid findings on the PBS, then they give you sort of an extra PBS. It's like, when you fail a test, you get makeup work, right? You got to do something to make up for it the following day. And so that's kind of how this process works, right? And so if your invalid findings are final, right? Your protests this year are not successful, you'll get another PBS the following year in 23, sort of an off-cycle PBS. And you won't, and actually this is, you won't be eligible for grace that year. Because again, you did not have valid findings the previous year, right? So that means your room for error, right, is a little tighter, right? You can't be here. If you're here, you're automatically going to get those state values assigned, right? So in 23, if that protest isn't successful, you have a sort of narrower range of tolerance there. And then in 24, the normal PBS year, obviously you would do the PBS, and there would again be no grace period, no grace eligibility allowed there, right? So you'd have to be within that plus or minus 5%, or whatever that confidence interval is for you, to get your local value certified, right? So you're kind of have a little bit of a tightrope you got to walk in 23, 24. 25, you get a little bit of a reprieve because it's not a PBS that year. So the controller's office is going to be, looking super closely at your values. And so that you'll most likely get local values used in 25, assuming everything goes right in 23 and 24. And then you're eligible for grace again in 26. Okay, so that would be the timeline. If again, your protest in 22 is not successful, but your CADs are able to kind of clean things up moving forward. Because I'm always such an optimistic person, I wanted to include another sort of an even worse case scenario where you get state values assigned in 22, and on that subsequent PBS in 23, you get in trouble again, and you get state values assigned. And the consequences are going to be similar, right? You can see listed there. You'll do your PBS in 24. if you pass that, that's not going to trigger another PBS in 25. But you can see just getting invalid findings in 23 delays your eligibility for grace by 2 years, right? And that's because of this alternating PBS map cycle, right? So again, to be eligible for grace, you have to have 2 green boxes, right? In for PBS in the prior cycles, right? And so because of this map, because there's no because you failed this PBS in 23, now it's going to kick out that possible eligibility for grace another 2 years. And so that's why even if you, let's say you didn't get state values assigned and you just have a grace period, right? I would still recommend protesting, because that's going to allow you, if you're successful in a protest with and you're in grace period, that can still help you get eligible for grace period in the future. And again, grace period is where your local values are outside of that range, and the controller's office kind of gives you a yellow light, right? They say it's a warning, right? They say, we're going to take your low values now, but if you don't turn things around, we're going to assign state values in the future. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how the findings are determined. That's sort of how the implications of the property value study, how grace eligibility works. I want to next turn to just some of the data within Region 1. If your name is not on this slide, that's a good thing. That means you did not get state values assigned, and there's no difference between your local and state values. If your name is on the slide, you got to come see me after class. No, just you should be aware that there is you did get state values assigned. There's going to be an impact in your funding if your protest isn't successful. The numbers highlighted in red are indicating those that got values automatically assigned. Those in yellow, Santa Maria and Santa Rosa, are those that got state values assigned because they've exhausted their grace period. So they're not quite in this zone, they're over here, but because they've exhausted their grace period, they're not, for whatever reason, they're not eligible for grace. And so they got state values assigned being in this zone. So again, this is the difference between state and local. And when I talked about that 25% increase earlier in values, that's the sum of all these numbers essentially, right? So this represents a 25% increase in your tax base due to all of these values being added to your T2 and all your T values for state funding purposes. Next slide shows the estimated revenue impact. Romualda is aware that we presented a very similar slide to your superintendents on Wednesday, and we were hopeful that TEA was going to clean up some of its hold harmless calculations and possibly mitigate some of the impact of the invalid findings. We got some bad news yesterday afternoon from TEA that no, that's how they're going to implement the hold harmlesses, particularly the maintenance of effort equity hold harmless. And so the cost of all this, the PBS invalid findings, just ticked up. I think when we presented it to your superintendents, it was around 26, 27 million total. I think if you add up all those, you are right around 35 million. And so because of that implementation of the maintenance of effort equity calculations, essentially those hold harmlesses don't provide the protection that we think they would have because of TEA's implementation, right? And so again, just kind of walk through how getting state values assigned impacts your budget. You guys have heard me give this analogy plenty of times, so hopefully it's familiar, but You know, when I'm explaining school finance, or when I'm just thinking about how school finance works, a useful analogy for me is thinking about all those complicated entitlements and allotments as the state assigning your school district a bucket, right? All of those, regular program, bilingual, comp ed, all those things go into determining how big of a bucket your school district gets. And once the size of that bucket is determined, then you start pouring in local dollars, right? The impact of getting state values assigned is whenever the state goes in to pour in local funds to that bucket, they are going to look at your higher property values that the controller has sent over to TEA, right? They're going to say that Brownsville's values, for example, are $2 billion higher than the tax base that Brownsville is actually taxing on, right? So when they go and draw that line for the local share, they're going to draw it much higher than what Brownsville can actually bring in with their tax based on their taxes, right? And so that creates a little bubble in your bucket, right? Your local dollars only fill up so much. Then there's this bubble, and then the state draws that local share line, and then it starts filling up state aid from that local share line up to the top of your entitlement. And so that is the impact of the property value study. Is it, to be sort of glib about it, is it creates a bubble in your bucket, right? There's this gap in funding that your taxes can't cover, but the state doesn't make up for with state aid. One thing I do want to point out is that recapture districts get that bubble kind of taken care of a little bit. The state looks at the size of that bubble and adjusts their recapture amount by the size of that bubble. And it reduces their recapture payment by the size of that bubble. And so, for example, you can see Point Isabel and Los Fresnos here, comparable levels of value increases due to getting state values assigned. But if we move over here, you can see the impact of the revenue impact is not the same, right? Because Point Isabel is a recapture district, they get a significantly reduced sort of hit to their revenues because, again, the state looks at the size of that bubble that's created by the $800 million and then reduces Point Isabel's recapture amount. They don't do that. There's no recapture to adjust for Chapter 48 districts. And so that's if you're kind of scanning this table and you see, on this slide, all the districts are ordered by the size of the value change, right? And it's highest value change in Brownsville down to lowest value change in Santa Rosa. But the revenue impacts don't track the same way, right? You can see it kind of bounces around. Rio Grande gets a $2.3 million hit, Roma gets a $4 million hit, and it's not consistent. And one reason for that is the recapture issue I just mentioned. The other reason is the hold harmless, right? And particularly the maintenance of effort equity hold harmless. Different districts have different targets under that hold harmless. And so I think that's one reason why Rio Hondo and I think Lyford, you can see they don't have a revenue impact because of that the target that was set for them under that maintenance of effort equity hold harmless. So if we think about it, right, the getting state values assigned for Chapter 48 districts creates that bubble in your bucket. That means you're essentially losing state aid, right? That's going to lower your revenues. That's going to lower your revenues per student, right? And the way these hold harmlesses work is it's all revenues per student. And so if you have a hold harmless target that's higher, right, under the maintenance of effort equity money, and let's say with local values, you're below that target, Okay, well, state values assigned is going to bring you down, but that hold harmless will just bring you back up to that target level per student funding. And so for a number of districts, that hold harmless, the maintenance of effort equity or the formula transition grant, is offsetting a lot of the impact of state values assigned. And so if you're in that boat, great. But just know that maintenance of effort equity, this is the last year for that. And then formula transition grant expires after next school year. Right. So we're fortunate to have these hold harmlesses, but they are not always going to be there. And so, if you have that, consider yourself lucky that those are in place there. But if we have this situation, this level of invalid findings throughout Region 1, you're not going to have that protection guaranteed moving forward. And I think, Romalda, I don't know if you're near a microphone, but we refreshed. So we passed out details on these revenue estimates to your superintendents on Wednesday. Of course, because of the bad news from TEA and the maintenance of effort equity money, we updated all this, and we sent Romalda and her team last night updated summary finance reports that shows the impact of getting state values assigned. And so, I think hopefully, Romalda, you got those, and your team was able to pass those out today.
Hi, Josh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, Romalda had to step out, but yes, she has them printed out here. So
Okay.
I guess after our meeting, we can hand them out, but we do have them.
Great. Awesome.
Josh, this is
Yes.
from Laredo. So even under a grace period, there's a decrease in revenue because of those maintenance of equity? No?
No. So if your grace period, so again, all of this here, this shows the increase in your values because of the PBS, right?
Right.
Grace period means you don't have an increase in your value. So state is saying, okay, we're a little worried about your values. They look a little low, but we're going to let it slide this year. Right. So as a result, there's no impact. There's no funding impact because your values aren't changed. Right. You're still
under
getting
grace period. Right.
You're in grace period. Right. But just know that grace period is sort of a warning, right? If you're in the same boat, but depending on, you can get up to 2 years of grace. And Flora, we can visit offline about y'all's situation, and I can look at y'all's data. But
no, we're good. We protested last year, and we were successful. So I encourage all those districts to protest.
Yeah,
there might be some valid reasons, but I'm thinking that I'm assuming all of these districts are in the first year, so do not panic. You may be under the grace period.
Well, all of these districts here were so low that they weren't eligible for grace, right? They were so low, they got automatically state values assigned. And so they do need this is a revenue impact that they will feel if they don't protest, and if their protest is not successful, right? So, for example, Brownsville will lose 22 million in change if those values that are on the PBS are used, are sort of the final values. So yeah, if we're talking about the impact of protesting and whether or not it's worth your time, I would say it's very much worth your time if you're on this list here. And even if you're not, if you got grace period like Floor, it's still worth your time because of what we talked about with the grace period eligibility, right? If you get grace period, that can extend, and I don't have this really on this slide in particular, but if, let's say, Floor didn't protest last year, then she had to burn up one of her grace period years, well, then that extends the timeline where she could possibly be eligible for grace again, right? So let's say she uses the first year of grace last year, the second year of grace this year. Now she's got to pass the PVS 2 times to be eligible for grace again. And so that's a longer timeline than if she had, since she protested last year, it was successful. Now she's got valid findings on her PVS on the books, right? So that counts as 1 year. And then if Flora, you got grace period this year too?
No, we're good.
No. Okay. So now that's another year. She's got that flexibility now where if her values fall in this zone, the hammer's not going to come down from the state, right? They're going to say, okay, we don't like where your values are, but we're not going to hurt you on your funding, right? We're going to let it slide for a year, maybe 2 years, while your CAD works things out. Okay. And so again, that's the mechanics of property value study and the impacts it can have, and why those impacts vary from district to district. Again, it's going to be due to whether or not you're recapture and whether or not you're you have a good target established under that maintenance of effort equity money. The last thing I want to touch on, and we're getting close to 10 o'clock. There are a number of bills that provide various ways to fix this problem. And I have a list of them on here. I'm going to sort of rattle them off to you in case you are on this list, or even if you've got grace period and you want to get engaged on this issue. Give me one moment. Yeah, so one of them is HB 2463 and Senate Bill 924, I believe, or 942, I believe. It's from Senator Hinojosa. Those bills, I'm sorry, yeah, Senate Bill 942 and House Bill 2463. What those bills do is they create a hold harmless, a 2-year hold harmless for districts that get state values assigned, right? So what this would do is your CADs would sort of start to feel the heat a little bit, right? Because they would have invalid findings. But Brownsville ISD, for example, would get a $22 million reduction in their funding, but the hold harmless would provide an offsetting $22 million of revenue, right? And that would last for 2 years of getting state values assigned. And so you can think of it as an additional kind of grace period, right? So under current law, you get up to 2 years of grace period. What House Bill 2463 and Senate Bill 942 would do, they're identical bills. They would sort of provide, you'd technically get state values assigned, but you'd have up to 2 years where there's no funding implications of getting state values assigned, right? And so you would get a hold harmless amount that corresponds with the numbers on this table for you. So we think that makes a lot of sense. It provides some protection to school districts. Of course, it's not permanent protection, but it can hopefully give your CADs a little bit longer runway to fix this problem. And then there's a number of other bills. Let's see. There is Senate Bill 1064. What Senate Bill 1064 does is, going back to this confidence interval range, it extends this range. Right now it's plus or minus 5% for most districts. It extends this to plus or minus 10%, and then changes this calculation to be, let's see, I believe it's 80% of the lower confidence interval, right? And so again, for most districts, that would be, so the lower end would be 90%, and then let's see. So that would change this for most districts down from 85.5% down to 72%, right? You have to be lower than 72% to get state values assigned automatically. And so that would kind of, again, broaden out all of these ranges. So that way you have to, be really, really off of state value to get in trouble. So again, that's Senate Bill 1064. The other ones I mentioned was House Bill 2463 and Senate Bill 942. There's another one, House Bill 971, what that would do is change the frequency of the PBS, right? So on this slide, I showed PBS is every other year, right? It alternates PBS map. What House Bill 971 would do, and this is from my rep in Austin, Representative Goodwin, what her bill does is it would change the PBS from being every 2 years to every 4 years, right? So you would do a PBS in 22 and 26, right? And then 30, right? That would be how that would sort of, it would help you avoid getting in trouble in the first place. And so that would be that proposal. So there's a number of bills that are floating around there that could help. I will say the expanding the confidence interval range, that has been a proposal for every session that I've been following. So at least probably 10 years now that's been sort of proposed and discussed. We'll see how if that makes it over the finish line. I'm less hopeful that policy proposal would be implemented. I do think that hold harmless, though, with House Bill 2463 and Senate Bill 942. That one is, I think, a more creative solution to the problem. I think that what that does is, right now school districts are caught, they're caught in this crossfire, right, between CADS and the controller's office. And it's unfortunate, there's nothing you can do, right? You don't set the values, you can't really influence them. And so you're kind of just at the mercy of your CAD with all this. And so what those bills do is kind of, at least for 2 years, it kind of gives you some protection from the crossfire, right? You don't get hit on your budget. Other groups out there are advocating essentially doing away with the property value study altogether, or just basing your local fund assignment, your local share, on the taxes you actually collect. That would get you out of the crossfire between the CADS and the controller's office. We grant that, but we don't see the state going for that. If we think back to the purpose of the PBS is really there to protect the state treasury, right? Because if CADs are out there, arbitrarily lowering their values and not assessing the property values correctly or uniformly across the state, then we get into this Wild West situation, right? Where kind of what we had before the PBS. You'd have some counties that would, for political reasons or for whatever else, they'd appraise their values at, fractions of the market value, less than 50% in some cases, while other CADs, would sort of assess closer to market value. And so, that starts to raise some constitutional questions about uniform taxation, and it could be a drain on the state treasury. And so we just don't see lawmakers going back to those sort of Wild West days of without sort of state oversight of the appraisal system. And so we don't think that that's likely. But this sort of hold harmless idea, I think, is a relatively newer proposal. And I think it checks a lot of the boxes, right? It doesn't do away with the PBS. There's still some skin in the game. But it provides some protection for folks out there. And so, yeah, we are at 10:05 on the dot. If you guys have any, I guess I have a couple more slides on summary finance updates. We'll go through these quickly. Once TEA plugged in all this data into the summary finance, all those property value increases, state aid shot down by $2 billion. State share declined to 31%. And just quick note on 31%, you may see different numbers from TEA or LBB. We don't think that they do it fairly or accurately. The calculation of the state share, LPB and TEA like to include recapture as state money, right, rather than local dollars. We would disagree with that. And so there's some other sort of technical disagreements that we'd have on that, on their calculation. So I think per TEA or LPB, it may be 40%. Once you do this the right way, the state share is actually 31%. So just wanted to throw that out there. Again, because of those value increases, recapture has increased almost $1 billion. Now it's, I think, about 4.2 billion. Because of all that, the state's looking at around a $3.5 billion surplus, right? So last year, I think it was about 1.2, maybe 1.5 billion, somewhere in there. And what the governor's office did with that money, if you remember, right, they took 400 million of it and gave it back to you as a school safety facilities grant, right? So obviously it wasn't the full surplus, but you know, that's a good precedent that the governor established with you know, FSP surpluses to give it back to, you know, those are dollars that were appropriated to public ed. They should stay in public ed. And, you know, we were encouraged by the fact that the governor sort of reallocated that back to facilities instead of just pocketing the money and putting it in you know, the general revenue fund, which the state has done, you know, historically. We would like to see the state do something similar again with this $3.5 billion of FSP surpluses. And so, you know, that $3.5 billion could go a long way to helping school districts secure their facilities, to doing any number of you know, solving sort of short-term problems or one-time paying for one-time expenditures, right? And so we're encouraging folks to think about that creatively and hopefully pass some legislation that requires the LBB or the governor's office to take that surplus money and give it back to schools, right? Not to pocket it into GR. We don't want that. But, you know, just be aware that there is a pretty substantial surplus likely coming from the FSP. And so we got to start getting engaged on keeping that money in public ed. Some other odds and ends. TEA added a line for state reimbursements tied to refunds. So this is folks that, if any of y'all have bought a home recently, you know that at least, or maybe not this year, but in prior years, you know that you couldn't get your resident homestead exemption until the following year, right? Because it was as of January 1. What this was passed in the last session, I think in a special session. What it does is it provides a refund to homeowners that purchased their residence homestead after January 1 and are eligible for a resident homestead. And so it will require a refund to be given. And so your assessor collector, this should be on their radar. If it's not, I would encourage y'all to reach out to them and talk to them and say, hey, how are y'all implementing Texas Education Code? All right, well, that references to the hold harmless. That's in law. But how are you implementing these refunds for the new resident homestead folks? And I can look up the citation over in the tax code to help y'all communicate with your assessor collector. But so there will be some refunds that need to be issued because of this. This section of the education code provides you a hold harmless for that, right? So whatever goes out as a refund, you get back as state aid. Okay, so you'll need to get this information from your assessor collector, and you'll need to report it to TEA. On the other elements of FSP, we talked about ADA, we talked about property values, how those are updated. ADA is being updated. That will be updated with at least part of it with the fall snapshot. We'll see those comp ed counts be included very soon on 22-23. You can also see here that in March, they take that fall snapshot and adjust it due to the prior year's attendance to enrollment ratios. And so you'll see that on the DPE column in March. And so that DPE column should be more accurate. I think generally, at least at a statewide level, once they do that update in March, it's surprisingly accurate with where ADA ends up at the end of the year. And so I think that is something to keep an eye on once March rolls around. And then this document here, I think I've showed this to y'all before, but this is from TEA. I think our own Amy Ma developed that. She was heading out the door at TEA. So that's a good resource. This is clickable. This is a link to TEA's website. We can go and view the whole document. It goes through all the other elements of the summary finance. So encourage y'all to go take a look at that. Wrapping up here quickly, we'll talk about ESSER. The next couple slides, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but this just has some updated sort of aggregate level information about ESSER. It could be useful if you're trying to sort of gauge, you know, your plan, if your spending is in line with how other districts are spending ESSER. So you guys are aware of all this stuff on this slide, sort of the total amount of ESSER, the amount that's used for supplement. But the interesting parts are on the next couple slides. First, the ESSER drawdown for ESSER 2, which the grant period expires September 30th. That is coming up very quick. We're only, you know, we're less than 2/3 of the way drawn down on those funds. And if we, you know, in our office, we've kind of looked at, okay, what's been the drawdown rate over the past couple of months? If we extrapolate that forward, I think we're around, we still leave $500 million on the table by the time September 30 rolls around. So we're hoping districts are expediting that drawdown rate, you know, for ESSER 2 in particular. And then we still got a whole, not even halfway done with ESSER 3, which expires, that grant period runs out September 24th. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys are aware of all this stuff, but just wanted to sort of give you some high level state aggregate data, at least as of earlier this month. And so this is where we're at statewide. And then in terms of how districts are using ESSER, you know, we presented a version of this before to y'all that was prior to the agency changing that survey, right, that they conduct, or those reports that you have to fill out. They tweaked that, brought down that other category to only $29 million statewide. But you can kind of see what districts are using those funds on, you know, the leader staffing model and planning supports, teacher pay increases, additional teachers, student services are all leading the way on ESSER usage across the state. If we take all that information and sort of collapse it into recurring costs, one-time costs, or unknown, that is the breakout there. So roughly kind of around 1/3 in each category. So of course, again, preaching the choir here, but for those recurring costs that you're using ESSER for, make sure you have an exit strategy. You know how you're going to handle that, or at least you're communicating to your superintendent and your community on the fact that these are recurring costs, and once ESSER runs out, we will not be able to pay for them any longer, or you're going to find other sources for those. Okay, and that is finally it. So sorry, Romalda, went over a little bit, but let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll see if I can get on the chat. It's not letting me click on that. Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah, so Flora, yeah, I think we touched on your question about the reduction of revenue under the grace period. The answer is no, there would not be any revenue impacts if you are under grace. Let's see, are there any other questions from those in the room or out here in Zoom land with me?
Josh, we don't have any questions from those in attendance in person.
Okay.